Hey everybody, this is the last of my sort of big picture introductory videos of the 4 main sections of the book that I'm writing. That book is called A Christian Case Against Donald Trump. And I've done videos on the other 3 sections already, introducing those. The way of peace versus the way of the demagogue, the way of truth versus the way of the deceiver, and the way of justice versus the way of the oppressor. So today I'm introducing the final section of that book, which is going to be the way of love versus the way of the predator. Now, because I know how the internet works, let me predict what some of the comments are going to be based on the title of this section. I know that there'll be people who only see the title of the video and they're going to make comments like, well, I'm not voting for a pastor, I'm voting for a president. Or they'll say, get real, this world is ruthless and we need strong people to defend us, not some squish who talks about peace and love and flowers and whatnot. So I just want to pre-respond to those comments right now. That's not going to be the point when I talk about the way of love versus the way of the predator. It's got nothing to do with strength versus weakness. I mean, of course, we need strong leaders. That's actually one reason that I oppose all of Donald Trump's sycophants who've shown just incredible weakness, in my view, in the face of his political bullying. I mean, how can I expect any of these people to do the right thing for the nation in the face of like a serious risk to themselves when they aren't even willing to risk their political careers to oppose Donald Trump? They represent, for me, the perfect examples of the opposite of the principle that I'm going to be talking about in this video. The way of love is the way of serving the other, not oneself. And every one of those politicians who claim to be motivated by their faith in Jesus to serve their constituents, but then turn around and serve their own political career instead by supporting Donald Trump, they've betrayed the way of love. And if that sounds like a weird definition of love, then here's the thing. The kind of love that I'm talking about is the kind that Jesus displayed, a self-sacrificial love, a love that drives us to serve the interests of others. The Greek word for that kind of love is agape, and it's all over the New Testament. So for just a few minutes, I'm going to talk about what this sort of love looks like in Scripture, and then I'll make the case that it's not crazy to ask our political leaders to operate out of this kind of love. It ought to be a bare minimum requirement, since we live in a system that gives us an opportunity to choose our leaders. But first, I am going to throw a few Bible verses at you here. So bear with me, my atheist friends. I love that you listen to these talks. And I think that even most of you are probably going to know some of these passages. This is how basic these passages are to what it means to be a Christian. I think everyone knows this, but I have to say it anyway. So now, I don't know if this still happens, but there used to be a guy with a rainbow wig, if you remember, who held up signs at football games that said John 3:16. And that passage reads, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." To John, this was the clearest picture of God's love for us, that he sent his Son into the world sacrificially on our behalf. I'm not here to debate like our various theories of the atonement here. I just want to point out that sacrificing on another person's behalf is at the heart of the Christian definition of love. So in John 15:13, Jesus says, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." And in the first letter of John 3:16, John writes, "This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters." But Jesus also calls us to something even higher than simply loving our friends sacrificially. In Matthew 5, he says, You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven." He's not telling us to have feelings of affection for our enemies. He's not even telling us to view our enemies as like brothers or sisters. He's telling us to agape love our enemies, as much as it's in our power to work for their good, not to hate them or to seek to destroy them. Now, obviously, it does require wisdom to know how to apply this sort of teaching as a political leader. But politics doesn't just simply negate the call of love on our lives. So say what you will about Nancy Pelosi. Some people on this channel are fans and some aren't. But she gave us a good example of this exact thing a few years ago. When she was Speaker of the House, she never denied that Donald Trump was her opponent. She may have even seen him as her enemy. I don't know if she would have called him her enemy or not. But if she did, she wouldn't be sinning by calling him her enemy. Jesus didn't tell us not to have enemies. You can't be in a position of power and leadership and not have enemies. Jesus told us to love our enemies, as much as it's in our power to seek their good. And I don't know exactly what it meant for Nancy Pelosi to love Donald Trump in an agape love sort of way, but I do know this. She understood Jesus' teaching on this point, and when she was asked in a news conference as she was leaving the room if she hated Donald Trump, she came back to the microphone and got a little bit heated, and she wanted everyone in the world to know that as a Christian, she did not hate Donald Trump. She was not allowed to hate Donald Trump as a Christian. And in that moment, whether one agrees with all of her policies or not, she represented Christ as a political leader better than Donald Trump ever has. Now, one last beautiful example of what love looks like from Scripture, if you know the account, before Jesus was arrested, the Apostle Peter bragged to him about how he would never deny Jesus. But after he was arrested, Peter was asked publicly if he was one of Jesus' followers, and Peter denied him 3 times. So this scene takes place after Jesus has been crucified and has risen from the dead. Peter meets Jesus on the shore, and Jesus cooks fish for him. And then Jesus gives Peter 3 opportunities to undo the 3 denials that he made. So in John 21, it says, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." And the 3rd time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the 3rd time, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." So Jesus tells Peter, the evidence that you love me is that you care for my people. That's what love ought to look like from a leader's perspective. So here's my point. Yes, of course, Jesus is the best example of that sort of love. No one can measure up to Jesus' standard of agape love. But the Word existed before Jesus' ministry on this earth. It's just that when he came into this world, people looked at him and listened to his message, and they saw in him the most perfect embodiment of agape love. But we don't get to just let ourselves off the hook or let our chosen leaders off the hook simply because none of us can attain Jesus' level of perfection in this regard. So here's my basic premise, that the kind of love that drives us to serve others is the proper motivation for a person to seek leadership. The way of good leadership, whether the leader is a Christian or not, is the way of other-focused love. I mean, I will happily vote for any candidate who understands that their calling as a leader is to focus on meeting the needs of the people that they serve. I don't care if they're a Christian or a person of some other faith or a person of no faith. The principle is for everyone, and we're foolish if we don't demand it of our leaders. So when I talk about, I'm not talking about sentimentalism or weakness or even being especially good with people. What I'm talking about is having the orientation towards the good of the other, toward the good of the people I'm leading, even at the expense of my own desires or comforts. That's how I approach my work on this channel. And that's how the President of the United States ought to approach his or her work. The specifics, of course, are going to look different, but the basic orientation away from self and toward the one being served, that's for everybody. The reason that most of us revere Abraham Lincoln is that we understand that just how flawed he was. We understand his inner turmoil and the failures that he experienced in his life, but we can't deny that when his people needed him, he poured out everything he had to serve the nation that he believed was the last best hope of earth. He wasn't weak. He waged a brutal civil war to hold the nation together, but no one can deny that he sacrificed his happiness in the final years of his life to serve the nation that entrusted him with political leadership. That's what agape love looks like in a president. And here's something that might sound crazy. Even Richard Nixon demonstrated a level of this sort of love for the nation when he resigned, rather than put the nation through the sort of turmoil it would have come if he'd chosen to stay and fight for himself. So this is what I mean when I say we're not looking for perfection. We're looking for a basic orientation toward the good of the other, the good of the ones being served. Bono, from the band U2, wrote these words years ago in a song called Party Girl, and they stuck with me as a young guy when I heard them. He wrote, "When I was 3, I thought the world revolved around me. I was wrong." What a simple, profound statement. When I was 3, I thought the world revolved around me. I was wrong. Now, here's what I've learned in the 40 years since I first heard that song. If we want to be any earthly good to anyone, the first step is to learn that basic lesson. The world does not revolve around me. That's the essence of love, to recognize the other and to orient yourself towards serving the other. A few weeks ago, I made a video where I talked about how Jesus interacted with the political leader Herod. I'm not going to repeat most of what I said in that video except to say this. We could have no clearer contrast from Scripture of how Jesus understood proper leadership and how Herod led. If you remember from that video, Jesus called Herod a fox. And shortly after that, Jesus weeps over Jerusalem and says, "Oh, how I would gather your children under my wings like a mother hen gathers her chicks." He's talking about protecting the chicks, protecting the people, sacrificially, rather than running off and leaving the chicks to be eaten by the fox. So he's saying there's one kind of leader who sacrifices herself for her people, and there's another kind who preys on the people that he's called to protect. The way of love versus the way of the predator. Jesus says something similar in a different section, and this passage especially applies, I think, to the Speaker Mike Johnsons of the world, who profess Christ with their lips, but they serve the predator and leave their followers unprotected. Jesus said, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he's a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep." So we've got three kinds of leaders going on here. We've got the ones who sacrifice themselves for their people. We've got the predators, and we've got the hired hands. The central problem in Republican politics today, which is dominated, by the way, by people who claim to follow Jesus, is that a true predator showed up on the scenes. And it turned out that the leaders were mostly just hired hands. And the hired hands, rather than sacrificing even something as simple as their own political careers to oppose the predator and serve their people, sacrificed the few true shepherds in their midst instead. So that's where we stand today. So now that's just all introductory to, in future videos, I'm going to be going into more detail about what Donald Trump has revealed to us about himself in this regard. And it starts with the fact that he's not 3 years old, but he still thinks the world revolves around him. That basic orientation towards himself, rather than toward the people that he's asking to lead, is what makes him a lethal choice for the nation. And I know that you might be tempted to say that the world has been ruled by malignant narcissists for most of our history. For as long as human beings have existed, the strongest and most ruthless leaders, the ones who are most willing to lie, cheat, and steal to gain power, have usually been the ones who wrest control of the levers of power. I get that. But we fought a revolution in America over that issue. We have the privilege, we have the power as Americans to choose our leaders. But with great power comes great responsibility. It's immoral and short-sighted for a Christian to say, well, tyrants have always ruled, so I'm just going to hire my own tyrant to rule on my behalf. When we cast our votes, we're taking moral responsibility for that vote. We might try to dilute that responsibility by saying, well, 70 million people also voted for the tyrant. But that's not how Christian morality works. If you cast a vote for Donald Trump in 2024, 100% of your vote for president will be for a guy whose rampant predatory instincts are well documented. And several of those things about him have been adjudicated by courts of law, both civilly and criminally. So if we vote for Donald Trump now, knowing what we all know, the basic morality of our position is indefensible, even if we think something good might come of it. But like I said, it's also short-sighted because it's not going to go anywhere good. It's going to harm untold numbers of people. The rest of the videos under the section that I'm going to be making on the way of love versus the way of the predator are going to examine the reality on the ground of Donald Trump's predatory approach to power. And we'll see that he's committed so many cruel and abusive acts on a personal level, on a business level, and on a political level that for Christians to support him after everything we've seen is going to do untold damage to the nation and to the cause of Christ in the world. It's not a cheery topic, but we've got to talk about it. So thanks for listening.